Boy, do we have a special guest for you. We have Larry Schechter in the house. He's going to be talking about his new book, The History of Fantasy Sports. He's an Amazon best-selling author, 6-time Tout Wars champ, 3-time Labor League champ, 2-time CDM champ. He has been called one of the best fantasy sports players on the planet, and he's coming up next. Larry Schechter, welcome to the Believe in Fantasy Basketball podcast.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
So for me, I am a big fan of your work. When you popped up on my feed a few months ago, I looked and I was like, wait a minute, somebody wrote a book about the history of fantasy sports. So I don't know if you noticed, like I went and bought the book, I went and did some pictures, some posts, started reading it. And I just want to start, Larry, could you tell me a little bit about what led you to writing the book? Because it seems like a really compelling story of like challenges, physical health challenges that you went through. Do you mind just sharing a little bit of that?
No, sure. What happened is after I wrote my first book, Winning Fantasy Baseball, which was way back in 2014, after that, I would sometimes think to myself, do I have any other idea to maybe write some other book someday? And I never really had any ideas that would be worthy of writing a book, except for this one idea, which is I knew somebody needs to write the history of fantasy sports. How did we go from ideas people had years ago for games to where we are now with this multi-billion-dollar worldwide industry, millions of people playing all kinds of games, not just fantasy football or fantasy basketball, but you got fantasy Iditarod, fantasy wakeboarding, you got fantasy everything. You got news services, stat services, people doing podcasts like we are right now, XM radio station. It's crazy. I'm like, how did we get here? It's like, I sometimes I look at the world and I think the same thing. I'll look at the world and be like, we got skyscrapers and planes flying overhead. It's like, how did all this happen? We started as cavemen. And so I look at fantasy in the same way. Like, how did we get here from these ideas people had years ago? So I just had this idea for years that somebody needs to write like a comprehensive history and tell the story of how did this all happen. And I thought, I would probably write this book someday, but I never got around to it. And 2 years ago, actually a little over 2 years ago, I had a heart attack and I ended up on a ventilator for 5 days. And my life was in grave danger. And I was mostly unaware that I was on a ventilator. I had no idea I was on a ventilator 5 days. At some point, I became consciously aware that I was on a ventilator. And I realized, like, oh my God, my life is in danger. I'm too young to die. And I thought about, my kids. I want to see my kids, my current girlfriend. I want to marry her. I want to travel. All these things I want to do was going through my head when I had this realization I was on a ventilator. My life was in danger. And the thought went through my head, I should have written that book. And that stuck with me. So I recovered. But in my recovery, I really kept that thought in my head, like I should have written that book. And I got myself determined that I'm going to do it.
BetOnline is your number one source for all your sports betting needs this season, from baseball, golf, soccer, right to all the top fights in UFC and MMA and boxing. Every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head on over to our online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of our over 150 slot games. Head to the website today to get in on the action. Use promo code BELIEVE for your 50% free bet credit on your first deposit up to $250. Bet online, the game starts here.
And when I was recovering in the hospital, people became aware of what happened to me. I got a lot of messages of support from friends and family, and also a lot of people in the fantasy community. And, there were people in the fantasy community saying, Larry, like this community needs you. We love you, et cetera. So I got really committed. Like, I want to write this book, for everybody who plays fantasy sports because it's needed. And So I find, I recovered. Once I was recovered enough to begin working on it, I began, which was like around July, August 2 years ago, and I thought it was something I could knock this off in like 3 months probably. Oh my God, was I wrong? I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I spent 18 months of intense research, Googling one thing after another, looking up articles from years ago. And I did dozens of interviews, mostly on Zoom with all kinds of people. Some of them I would interview like 3 hours, like
Wow.
do an hour and a half and have to call them back for more. So it was just an unbelievable amount of work. But what happened is, as I started to do it, I set out and wrote the history of fantasy sports, what happened when, how this all happened. And as I started to get into it, I would start to hear like really interesting stories of what people did, like fascinating stories, some of them inspirational, a lot of humorous anecdotes, a few things that would even bring tears to my eyes. And I realized, early on, like there's so many great stories. What I need to do is if I just write like the history, it's going to come off like a boring research paper. It'll tell everything, but be like a boring research paper. But I can tell the stories of the people, and that will make it very, very interesting. So the book started out the history of fantasy sports, and because of this realization I had, that I got the subtitle. The subtitle is "And the Stories of the People Who Made It Happen." So what I've got this book that is, very easy to read. It's really interesting. And I'm not just saying this for myself. I'm saying this also based on the feedback, the reviews that people have left already. They're great reviews. People say it's easier to read. It's fascinating. It's inspirational. Anybody who likes fantasy sports is going to love the book. And even people who don't play fantasy sports, I've got a cousin who never played fantasy sports. He started reading it. He's like, this is excellent. Because it's like this, there's stories that are just really interesting. There's a lot of funny things. And it's a lot about entrepreneurs who started businesses. So it's not something that you even need to know about fantasy sports to enjoy it.
So Larry, tell me a little bit about the process. It seems like you went down like a series of rabbit holes and just ended up at different doorsteps getting these interviews. What was your thoughts around it, your creative process? Did you like plan it out, or did you just kind of wing it?
Well, kind of both. A lot happened. Like, for example, one of the first things I did was I looked at like some of the precursors of fantasy sports, and I knew that some people regard like Stratomatic and APA baseball, football as like a precursor of fantasy sports. And to me, I didn't really think it was that much of a precursor, because the big difference with like a Stratomatic or APA is a board game that's based on real player statistics, but it's from the previous year. So they're going to end up pretty much what the person did last year, whereas the fantasy sports we play, it's based on things that haven't happened yet. So if you draft a player, you kind of know what you expect he's going to do, but you never know what he's going to do this year. But so I thought, when I started, I thought I'll probably write like 2 or 3 paragraphs about Stratomatic and APA. And once I started researching it, I was like, holy crap, there's like so much involved with Stratomatic and APA that is like almost an entire chapter that was mostly about them. And people have played Stratomatic and APA for years and years. You got leagues that have been going on for 50 years continuously. One of the first great stories that I saw was a guy in an APA league, was in an APA league for something like 40 years. After about the 36th year, he got ALS. So he thought he was going to have to quit playing. But his wife said, listen, if you want to keep playing, I'll do whatever I have to do so you can keep playing. So his wife would go to the games with him, and like she'd roll the dice and he'd tell her what to do. And then his condition got worse and worse, where like 2-3 years later, he couldn't, the only way he could communicate was like through an eye reader and a computer. And, but he kept playing with his wife doing everything for him. and he would communicate what to do. And that year in the World Series, the uh, bottom of an extra inning, his team was 2 runs behind, and he scored 3 runs to win his first ever championship after 39 years in the league. And he burst out into tears, and everybody else burst out into tears.
Wow, that's so good. You know what, Larry? My introduction into creating content was rooted in a tragedy. My brother, when I was reading your intro of your book, and you said you had a heart attack, my brother passed away in 2021 of a heart disease. You know, a heart condition he had, and when he passed away, I was just in a place where like I didn't want to do much, but I knew that I always wanted to start a fantasy basketball channel, you know? And before he passed away, he was telling me that, hey, like, I want to like start this gaming channel. So it tripped me out that this guy that was on his deathbed was like excited about creativity. So when he passed, I kind of just used it as motivation to start my channel. So I can relate to that whole emotional aspect. And one other thing, I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy named Mike Tagliere. He was
I don't think so.
he was a very prominent fantasy football analyst for for one of the big networks, and he passed away during this same period of my brother passing and of COVID-19. And it kind of just motivated me to say, like, you know what, life is so short. I've been wanting to do this thing. I'm just going to do it. So I can really relate to that.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I didn't mention about my story is it's pretty much a miracle that I survived. You know, being on a ventilator for 5 days. It was they were not, you know, I heard, obviously I didn't know it at the time. I was unconscious through most of it, but you know, they weren't expecting me to survive. And when I got out of I was in the hospital for 3.5 weeks. Then I was in rehab for about 11 days. You know, I couldn't walk. When I went to rehab, I couldn't even stand up. But when I finally got home, I called my cardiologist to have a follow-up appointment. And, you know, he's the one that had sent me off. He's the one that had like done this procedure where everything went to hell, and they put me on a ventilator and sent me off to a different medical center. And so I called his office to schedule a follow-up. And, you know, when you call your doctor to schedule a follow-up, you know, maybe like some nurse or, you know, secretary will call you back in a couple hours and make an appointment, you know. But what happened is when I called his office and I left a message, within like 20 minutes, I got a phone call from the doctor. And I answered, and he's like, Larry, you're alive? Like, oh my God, it's a miracle.
Wow, that's insane. And you know, there are people out there right now, Larry, like, and hopefully this catches someone's ear who is putting off the thing that they've wanted to do. Something is holding them back. It's a personal barrier or external barrier. What would you say to that person who's like, needs to write the book, needs to create the podcast, needs to pursue the dream, needs to complete the mission? What would you say to them?
Well, like you said, pursue the dream, you know, do it. Nike, just do it, you know, pursue it. And also one thing you just reminded me of, though, what you're saying is, I knew that I had a family history of heart problems, and I had like gone, you know, on a somewhat regular basis and got, you know, done some stress tests and things like this. Before I had the heart attack, I was like behind on, you know, what I should do. Like, you know, partly being forgetful, partly because of COVID. I should have had like some kind of follow-up or stress test, which maybe, you know, probably they would have found something and prevented the whole thing. But so what I'm getting at is, like, everybody listening to this, make sure you take care of yourself. If you're due for colonoscopy or any kind of medical thing, don't procrastinate, don't ignore it, do it. Take care of yourself, donate blood. You know, I got blood transfusions. Somebody, you know, someone or several people out there in the world somewhere have no idea, but they helped save my life.
Yes, that's good. That's good.
So if you donate blood, you actually may help save somebody's life.
Yep. And yeah, and I've been thinking about doing more like mission driven partnerships because many of our partners are like daily fantasy sports, we're partners with Bet Online, but I'm thinking about finding a nonprofit partner to just kind of highlight them. So thank you for that. Listen, I want to dig into some fantasy related stuff while I got one of the greatest fantasy baseball players in the world. And I wanted to see just the mind of a champion. So I have folks who are going to be watching. We're gearing up for NBA season coming up soon. Fantasy football season is coming up soon. I know we're in the middle of MLB season, but talk to me about the beginning of your journey as a fantasy player and how soon you started winning, and maybe some tips and tricks that folks can do just for mindset, because the games are different, right? Like, we know that fantasy baseball is very different than fantasy football or fantasy basketball, but there's probably general principles that will be applicable to just the mindset of a champion.
Yeah, definitely. And before I do that, I just want to tell you a quick story from the book, because this, because it's basketball related. Do you know Paul Charchian?
The name sounds familiar.
Paul Charchian started a magazine, and one of the very first magazines, and he's a big time radio host now. And he was the president of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association from 2009 to 2020. And Paul's one of the people that read my book early, and he said, he's been in the industry his entire life and didn't know a lot of the stuff that I wrote about. He said there was lots of fascinating stories he didn't even know. And the guy's been in the industry his entire life. But Paul is one of the guys, along with his partner. He started one of the first fantasy football magazines, and he did it out of his apartment. And he listed his apartment address as the address for the magazine. And one day he gets a knock on the door, and this guy says, "Hey, my name's Rick. I was going to subscribe to your magazine, and I looked at the address, and you're in my building. You're right upstairs from me. So I came up here to meet you." And then they kind of became, and Rick said, I'd like to, I want to subscribe to this, but I'd like to get involved. Could I write something? I'll even do it for free. So he started writing for free, and then eventually he got hired. And guess who this Rick is? Rick Kamla.
Wow.
That's how Rick Kamla got started in fantasy.
That's wild. That's wild. Because Rick also does general NBA broadcast stuff as well.
Right.
Wow.
Right. That's how he got started. Yeah.
So he got started in the industry through fantasy and just grew into doing general broadcast stuff. Right. I never knew that.
Yeah.
That is insane. Yep. Man, that's good. Thanks for sharing that.
There's so many stories. I mean, everybody listening to this, anybody listening to this obviously likes fantasy basketball or fantasy sports. Buy the book. I mean, you'll love the book. I'm not kidding. I know it's easy to say, "Oh, you'll love the book," but you really will. I'll give you, if you don't love the book, I'll give your money back.
I love it.
It's and the retail price, I only get a small part of the retail price. So if I give somebody their money back, I'm losing money on the deal. But you know what? It's you're going to love it. People will love it. You're
confident in that. I love that. I love that.
I am. And it's not like I did something great or I came up with some great idea. It's just the stories that I found out about people, and everything. So anyway, now getting to your question, there is a lot of similarity with fantasy baseball, fantasy football, and fantasy basketball. I don't play fantasy basketball anymore, but I used to. I've played baseball and football for years. I played basketball for a long time. And the similarities are making player projections. What is your best guess what a guy is going to do this year? Whether it's how many touchdowns he's going to score, how many home runs he's going to hit, or for basketball, how many points will he score, how many 3-point field goals, free throws, whatever other categories you got, rebounds, steals. Make your best projections. and then put them into a value formula. Now, some value formulas are easy. Like in fantasy football, it's pretty much all points. It's mostly all points. So it's easy to figure out what statistics a guy gets, how that translates into what the points he scores will be. And in like a rotisserie style game where you're ranking people in categories, like the team with the most runs gets 12 points and the next most runs gets 11 points, there it's harder to come up with a value formula. But you got to do it so you can see what's a player worth. So when you're drafting somebody or buying somebody at an auction, you have an idea of what's this guy actually worth and who's better than who. So there's a lot of similarities. And my book, Winning Fantasy Baseball, is like all about strategy and baseball strategy and how to do all this. And I would recommend that as well for someone for like basketball, because there's a lot of things that are in common. So you kind of you can kind of skip through things that are irrelevant to basketball, but then you get to some things where you're like, okay, yeah, this is going to apply to basketball just like baseball.
Very nice, very nice.
But I won't give the money back guarantee, and I won't say, oh, everybody's going to love the book. But for the history of fantasy sports, I mean, millions of people should read it. Yeah. I mean, like I can't believe how good it is. And as I was writing it, hearing story after story and talking to all these people, I just like, oh my God, this is going to be great. Because
yeah, and I think another thing about it too is that it just came out in January, right?
No, just in May, just like 2 months ago.
Got it. So It just dropped in May. So, with books, especially books that are not, based on some pop culture moment of right now. This is like something that will last the test of time, and for years people will read this. So it's a huge piece of literature for us to kind of, embrace because we don't have much like this. We got a lot of magazines, we got a lot of people talking, but we don't have like the books, And so I think that's really cool that we have one piece of history, that we can just have for generations.
Yeah, I mean, there's never been anything like this, and I'm pretty confident there'll never be anything like it again. And yeah, it's like the definitive history of fantasy sports, and that's what some of the reviews have said, that like this is the definitive history of fantasy sports, and it tells everything. I include everything. It's like precursors to fantasy sports, then the origins of fantasy baseball, the origins of fantasy football, the first commercial games, newspaper games, legal issues, the first books and magazines, the first radio and TV shows. Then you get into things like, Roto World and CBS, Yahoo, ESPN, those. You got injury experts, you got experts leagues, and you get, then you got daily fantasy came along, worldwide expansion came along. There's 200 million people in India playing fantasy cricket.
Yep.
That's more than the amount of people play fantasy sports in the U.S. Yeah, you're with Roto World, right?
I was.
You were.
Yep.
Okay, because it's like the whole story of how did Roto World come to be. I tell the whole story of how did Roto World come to be. It starts with two guys named Rich Pike and Michael Livto, who started a company called All Star Stats, which was one of the first stat companies, and that ended up evolving into what became Roto World, which is now NBC Sports.
Mm-hmm.
And I tell the story of that. I tell the story of how CBS Sports came to be for fantasy, and Yahoo and ESPN. Yeah,
and I know that in the States, fantasy football is king, right?
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about, because you got to see this happen from almost like the beginning of it, right? It wasn't really you were playing like with paper when you first started?
Well, I started fantasy baseball in about 1990, 1991.
So there was no internet.
No, it was no like there was correct. There was not like the first fantasy baseball league I was in. We did our draft on a conference call,
Wow.
and and then we would get our reports in the mail. So the week would end on Sunday, and Wednesday or Thursday the mail would show up with the standings.
That's so
Yeah, but I
crazy.
wasn't. Yeah, but I wasn't at the very beginning. I mean, that was like about 90, 91. But like the beginning, was like around 1979, 1980
Got it. Got it.
was like
Got it.
where like the first people started really playing. I mean, fantasy football goes back to like 1963, and fantasy baseball for the most part goes back to like 79. And people then it's like they'd have to get their statistics from the Sporting News box scores or the USA Today, and they'd have to do all the statistics by hand. And the commissioner of the league would do all that, it'd take him several hours, and then he'd hand out reports. And an entire industry sprang up from this. Like people would see things that were needed. My book tells stories of a lot of entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Like they started playing fantasy, and they would say like, "Well, it's really hard to get information," and they go, "Well, let's we should start a magazine." And other people were like, when computers started to come into existence, people would say like, "Gee, we could do statistics on a computer instead of having to spend 8 hours a week going through all the box scores." So people would start statistic services, and then other people would start other things like like information services like RotoWire and RotoWorld, and just the whole industry involved. And in fact, when I was done writing the book about all these people that did all these things, one of my editors suggested I should write an epilogue, which I originally didn't have, kind of sum it all up. So I thought, okay, that's a good idea, and I gave some thought to what do I want to write in the epilogue. And when I was thinking about what I want to write in the epilogue, it occurred to me I just did the same thing that these other people had done, even though some of them went back 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, where I saw there's nothing like this that exists and it's needed. So I did it. It's like the same guy that started the first fantasy football magazine because he saw, there's no magazines. We need a magazine. 50 years later, whatever many years later, I'm looking at it saying, nobody's written a comprehensive history of how this all happened. I'll do it. So it's kind of like I did this. I kind of blew my mind when I realized I was like, I just did the same thing all these other people did.
That is wild. And if you could give me the pecking order for the types for American fantasy, like so between football, baseball, basketball, hockey, maybe let's keep DFS out of it, just from the season long formats, what would be the pecking order?
Well, football is clearly the most popular by far. It's because it's the most popular sport, and for fantasy, it's easier to play. You got like 18 weeks compared, 18 weeks where the teams play one game a week, compared to baseball where it's like 26 weeks and they're playing 162 games. It's a long season, and basketball is like about this. Well, not as many, but it's like many months and 82 games. Are they still playing 82 games in the NBA?
Still doing 82.
Okay, yeah. So football's king, and baseball is I think second. Then after that, you got probably basketball and hockey. Although if you go like in Europe, soccer's the biggest, and in like India, cricket's the biggest.
And where does daily fantasy fit into the American landscape, and also where do you see it going in the next 5 years in relation to season long? Do you think that people are going to start stepping away from season long, especially new players, and they're going to start with daily fantasy? Or do you think that there'll still be a bit of a balance between season long and daily fantasy?
Well, I think that already started happening where, daily fantasy has attracted people who didn't play fantasy before. And, there are people that like daily fantasy that have never played season long fantasy, or, or maybe they like it, or that maybe they have and they like daily better. There a lot of people play both, but I think it's. I mean, I don't know. I don't have any crystal ball, but I would think it'd probably be kind of like similar. Season long is not going to go away.
Yeah. I think the convenience of daily for newcomers, right? Because if you think about it, especially when you're playing fantasy baseball or fantasy basketball, it's a lot of work. It's not, it's not something that it's like set and forget type deal. You have to have your ear to the street, fingers on the pulse to make sure that you're, ahead of the game and beating your league mates to opportunities. And I think for daily, it really just made things a lot easier. So that's something that I'm just watching because there are also different types of games that are popping up. One company that we are sponsoring or sponsors the show is Owner's Box, and they do a thing called lightning lineups where you press a button, Larry, and it's almost like you're at a casino. Like the players just go, and then you can say, I'll keep that lineup, or you can try to spin again. So the whole concept is you just randomly spin until you get the combination of players that you like, and then it goes against the house's 3 players, and then you have a winner. So, people are trying all kinds of stuff around fantasy and daily fantasy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that with everything we have now, people can still come up with something new.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So where would you like to see the industry go in the future then? So we can't predict what's going to happen with what's happening with daily fantasy versus season long. But if you had a magic wand and you could wave it across the fantasy sports community, besides going out to buy the book right now, right? Besides that, what would you want for our community?
I have no idea. I think it's pretty good like it is. I mean, I think what we have now is really good, and there really is a community. I mean, that's one thing. There's a lot of people that play fantasy sports, and they don't feel like they're part of any community. They're not doing podcasts and things like that. But there is definitely a fantasy community, and there's a chapter in my book about the experts leagues. We got baseball. The 2 big experts leagues in baseball are the USA Today sponsored Labor and Tout Wars, and there's a fantasy football experts league called FanX, and like there's a Scott Fish Bowl, and there's a Justin Mason created the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational. Now, the thing I'm trying to get at here is Scott Fish and Justin Mason, with what they did, they added a charity component to their experts leagues. So they've done a lot of good raising money for charity. And Justin Mason, one year for his Fantasy Baseball Invitational, he decides every year where the money's going to go for charity, and also the winner of the league, whoever wins the league. I think if I remember correctly, whoever wins the league gets to determine what charity gets half the money, and Justin Mason says who gets the other half of the money. One year, a fantasy analyst named Dan Stratford lost his wife. I think it was cancer, if I remember correctly. But anyway, he, very, very tragic. This relatively young guy lost his wife. He's got 3 daughters. It was very tragic. And he put it out on Twitter what happened. And he said, the response he got was overwhelming from the fantasy community. And then Justin Mason, announced shortly thereafter that all the money that year from his charity thing would go to Dan Stratford to help raise his 3 girls. And Dan, and Dan, I actually, when I found out about that, because I was including, I knew I was going to include Justin Mason and the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational in the book, but when I started to look into him and everything, I found out this story about Dan Stratford. So I contacted Dan Stratford, to get his take on it, see if he had comments. And he said that the fantasy community is great. The fantasy community goes a lot deeper than just debating which relief pitchers are the best. No, I was just gonna say there's some best ball leagues like with football where you draft a team at the beginning of the year and then you never make a move the entire year. You don't make a move. The computer every week figures out your optimal lineup.
The barrier to entry, if we can just create more ways to make that painless for people to get in, I think they'll evolve into the more advanced formats.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that made daily so successful is just easier to play, easier to get into, and you can enter it at any time. Like in basketball, you draft your team before the year, and then you have the team for the entire season. So if it's December 1st and you decide you want to play fantasy basketball, well, too late. You missed the draft. But daily, you could December 1st, I'll play daily fantasy basketball. And then, I want to take a week off and next week I'll play it 2 days. And, it's just, it's just a lot easier.
Yep. Cool. So, Larry, I'm going to share in the show notes and everything where people can grab the book. But you want to just give them one last nudge for them to go grab what is going to be one of the greatest pieces of work for fantasy sports?
Yeah. As I said, if you like fantasy, you'll love the book. You really will. And I know people are busy. A lot of people listening to this probably thinking, I'll probably get this book sometime, but they don't feel any sense of urgency to get it. Or, it's like maybe right now I feel like I'm too busy to read a book. Just get it. Go ahead, get it. Don't procrastinate. Get it. And if you don't have time to read it right away, if you have it, you'll read it. And once you start to read it, you'll probably find more time to read it. And it's available on Amazon, and it's available. Most online booksellers have it, paperback and ebook. It's starting to get into some stores, but that'll be a process. But online, Amazon and most others have it online.
Larry Schechter, it's been an honor connecting with you. I feel so grateful to have you on our show, and you're welcome to come back whenever you like, and I'd love to just talk more fantasy with you.